$1.5 trillion. That is the number some planners have attached to a railway that would run from Cape Town to Cairo, then north through the Middle East, and branch east towards Central Asia and China. Not a proposal from a single government, not a single construction contract. A vision assembled across dozens of countries, each with their own politics, terrain and debt limits. So how close is any of it to actually being built? The idea is older than most people realize. In the late 1800s, British imperialist Cecil Rhodes sketched out a Cape to Cairo railway as a tool of colonial control. He wanted a single corridor from the southern tip of Africa to the Mediterranean. One line, one empire. He never finished it. The politics of Africa made it impossible. The project died with the colonial era, and the continent was left with a rail network designed not to connect African cities to each other, but to move resources toward ports and out. That inheritance still shapes everything built today. Fast forward to the 21st century, and 3 separate continental rail ambitions have emerged. Each one is enormous on its own. Together they form the rough outline of what planners sometimes call a transcontinental corridor. The first is Africa's missing rail links. The African Union has identified what it calls the Programme for Infrastructure Development in Africa, a framework targeting a connected continental rail network by 2063. That date tells you how long this will take. The total funding gap for African rail infrastructure is estimated at around $68 billion per year. Not total, per year. Africa currently has roughly 84,000 kilometers of track. Much of it dates from the colonial period. Much of it uses different gauges, the physical width between the rails, which means trains from one country literally cannot run on another country's tracks without changing wheel sets. Standard gauge, Cape gauge, meter gauge. The continent has all 3, sometimes within the same country. Ethiopia and Djibouti completed a new standard gauge line in 2017, funded largely by China's Export-Import Bank and built by Chinese contractors. It cut the travel time between Addis Ababa and the port city of Djibouti from 3 days by road to 12 hours by rail. That line is functioning. It is also carrying about a third of the traffic it was projected to carry, because the freight economy connecting those cities has not grown as fast as planners hoped. That gap between infrastructure built and economic activity that follows repeats itself across the continent. Kenya completed its own Chinese-funded standard gauge railway in 2017, connecting Nairobi to the port of Mombasa. The line cost around $3.2 billion. It is faster than the old colonial era track it partially replaced. It is also running at a significant loss, with debt repayment to China posing serious fiscal pressure on the Kenyan government. The political tension embedded in Chinese infrastructure lending has shaped how African governments approach new rail projects. Some have slowed negotiations, others have sought financing from the African Development Bank, the European Union's Global Gateway Programme, or a mix of bilateral partners. No single funder has the scale to close the infrastructure gap alone. The second piece of this intercontinental picture sits in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and several Gulf states have proposed a Gulf railway network that would link 6 countries along a shared corridor. The Gulf Cooperation Council approved the plan in 2003. Original completion was targeted for 2017. It has not been built. Political disputes between Qatar and its neighbors, which escalated into a full diplomatic and trade blockade from 2017 to 2021, effectively halted progress. The design required Qatar's participation. After the reconciliation in early 2021, talks resumed. As of the mid-2020s, portions of the planned route are under construction in Saudi Arabia, but a unified Gulf network remains unfinished. Saudi Arabia alone has pushed ahead with its own national rail expansion. The Haramain high-speed railway, connecting Mecca and Medina, opened in 2018 after years of delays. It covers approximately 450 kilometers and carries millions of pilgrims each year. The kingdom is also developing plans for the land bridge, a proposed freight rail link crossing the Arabian Peninsula from the Gulf Coast to the Red Sea, connecting the port of Jubail in the east to Jeddah in the west. The route would allow container ships to bypass the Suez Canal entirely for some trade flows. That is the commercial logic driving much of the Gulf rail ambition. It is not passenger convenience, it is control over global freight corridors. Now here is where the numbers get harder to trace. When analysts compile the combined estimated costs of all proposed rail projects that would form a Cape to Europe or Cape to China corridor, the figure approaches $1.5 trillion. Some estimates place it higher, but that number does not represent a single budget. There is no master funder. There is no single construction timeline. The figure is the sum of dozens of projects across roughly 40 countries, many of which are not currently funded, contracted, or in some cases even formally approved by their own governments. $1.5 trillion is less a price tag than an accounting of the gap between what exists and what would need to exist. Who closes that gap? China has been the most active financier of developing world rail over the past 2 decades through its Belt and Road Initiative, but Chinese lending slowed sharply in the early 2020s as several recipient countries sought debt restructuring and Beijing reassessed the terms of its overseas infrastructure strategy. The Western alternative, led by the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment and the EU's Global Gateway, has pledged hundreds of billions toward infrastructure in developing nations. Critics note the pledges have moved slowly into actual construction contracts. The infrastructure financing world has a chronic problem. Governments commit, contracts get delayed, projects start, costs rise, the political will that launched the project shifts. Zambia, Mozambique, Laos, all have rail projects that ran over budget, ran into debt trouble, or are operating below the traffic levels needed to service their loans. In April of 2023, a group of African finance ministers meeting ahead of the World Bank and IMF spring meetings called specifically for new mechanisms to fund rail infrastructure without putting recipient governments into unsustainable debt. The problem is well understood. The solution is not agreed upon. The section of a potential intercontinental route that receives the least attention runs through the northeastern corner of Africa, specifically the Horn of Africa and Sudan. Sudan has faced years of internal conflict, a military coup in 2021, and a civil war that erupted in 2023 between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. A rail corridor that must pass through Sudan, or alternatively loop through Ethiopia and Eritrea, another country with its own history of conflict, faces obstacles that are not engineering problems. They are political problems, and political problems do not have engineering solutions. The same is true along the planned Gulf extension, a complete land corridor from the Arabian Peninsula into Turkey, which would be the natural northern link toward Europe, would require crossing through Iraq and Syria, 2 countries whose infrastructure has been devastated by prolonged conflict. An alternative routing through Iran would require political normalization between Tehran and the Gulf states that shows no sign of arriving in the near term. These are not pessimistic observations. They are the actual geography of the problem. And yet pieces are moving. Ethiopia's rail network is slowly expanding. Tanzania is building a standard gauge line from Dar es Salaam inland toward Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Egypt is constructing a new high-speed rail network connecting Cairo to Alexandria and further cities with a total planned length of around 2,000 kilometers. Egypt's high-speed rail contract, awarded in 2021 to a consortium including Siemens Mobility, is reported to be worth around $4.5 billion for the first phase. It would be the first high-speed rail network on the African continent, not a footnote, a landmark. The argument for building these corridors is not only economic. A train moves freight at a fraction of the carbon cost of a truck. In a region like East Africa, where road transport still dominates, electrified rail could change the emissions profile of trade across the continent. It could also change politics. Shared infrastructure has historically created economic interdependence, and interdependence creates incentives against conflict. Not always, not reliably, but the pattern exists. The argument against rushing the construction is also real. Debt-financed infrastructure that does not generate traffic does not pay for itself. Countries that borrowed to build and failed to earn traffic have ended up poorer, not richer. The project, if you can call it one, sits in this tension. Build too slowly and the continent stays fragmented. Build too fast and the debt becomes a trap. What exists today is a patchwork, functioning segments, some modern and some colonial era, gaps where tracks simply stop, border crossings where gauge changes force cargo onto trucks before it can continue. A dozen different national rail operators with no unified ticketing, no unified scheduling, no unified gauge. One generation of construction will not fix that. Neither will $1 trillion spent poorly. Whether the vision of a connected transcontinental railway eventually resolves into something real or stays permanent future tense will depend on decisions made by governments that do not yet exist, about finances that have not yet been arranged, across borders that may not yet be peaceful. The corridor is drawn on maps. The maps are not the terrain. The story of this project is still being written.